It's great to be here this morning, and thank you all for participating in this session. I know Unitarians have a long association with issues that are related to social justice and peace. And one of my former bosses was president of UUA, Bill Schultz, some years ago. And so I have some familiarity with the work of Unitarians. And so it's especially a pleasure for me to be here because of that as well. This morning I want to talk about the work of the organization that I head, the Center for Victims of Torture, which this month will be observing its 34th anniversary since its founding. And it's an organization that was founded right here in the Twin Cities. Some of you may know the story, with the then Governor Rudy Perpich, who was asked, as the story goes, by his son, who was then a law student. He asked his dad, you're governor, you're in a position of authority and power, and what are you doing to work on and help promote human rights? And his dad didn't have an immediate answer about what he was doing. So as people do in these situations, he formed a working group, a task force. He called together some prominent human rights people and lawyers in this community, and they examined the landscape, the human rights landscape at the time, which was rapidly growing. This was the mid-1980s. So Amnesty, where I was at the time, was growing, pretty rapidly and doing investigations and campaigning. Human Rights Watch was just getting started. The International Human Rights Framework was being built. But the task force that the governor formed, when they examined what role can be played right here in Minnesota, one of the things they found was that there was not an organization that was working with survivors of one of the most egregious forms of human rights abuse, that being torture. So they decided, let's give that a shot. And so that was 34 years ago in May 1985. The organization started with a very small house on the University of Minnesota campus, a tiny staff, a lot of volunteers, a shoestring budget, and today has become one of the 2 or 3 largest organizations of its kind globally. So the first half of CVT's, the Center for Victims of Torture, the acronym CVT, the first half of our existence was work domestically with survivors who had resettled in the United States or who were coming to the United States for specialized treatment. And we continue to do that work, and I'll talk about more of that soon. But since 1999, we've also expanded internationally. And today, our work, much of our work and our operations take place overseas. So from the very beginning, CVT's mission has been essentially this. You can see it's really quite focused to heal the wounds of torture on individuals, on families, in their communities, and to stop torture worldwide. So we have both the rehabilitative part of the mission and also the preventive approach, working to stop torture. And we do this both, again, domestically and internationally. So we basically have 4 areas that we work in: the healing work, the rehabilitative work, and this is work both at the physical level and the psychological level, working to heal the wounds of torture and war-related trauma. We have another component of our work, which is relating to capacity building. Because the numbers of survivors are so large, the number that we're going to be able to see at our combined locations, nationally or internationally, is always only going to be a tiny fraction of the total. Part and parcel of our approach to this work is to build local capacity and train the field, build the field of torture survivor rehabilitation. So that's a central component of our work. We also have an advocacy part of our operation. And this advocacy, and I'll talk more a little bit later in greater detail about this, but the angle that we try to play in this sphere is to bring the voice of survivors to policy debates and to have our advocacy informed by what we learn from working with survivors of torture. So we don't want to replicate what groups like Amnesty are doing, which has, a very large membership and can mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. We don't have a staff of hundreds in the policy side, as a Human Rights Watch does, and human rights experts who can make recommendations, specific recommendations to governments about changes they should make. But the role that we can play, we feel that others can't, in the same way we can, is to bring that voice of survivors to advocacy policies and advocacy initiatives. So that's the angle we approach our advocacy work from. So we do this at the federal level in Washington, D.C., where we have an office, also the state level, and locally. And finally, the fourth area is the research that we do to monitor, evaluate the treatment that our clinics provide in order to deliver the most effective treatment possible. So we want to make sure our work is evidence-based, that it's grounded in science, that we can adapt the models that we use in order to make it as effective as possible. Whatever level of resources we have, we want to have the largest impact that we can possibly have. And our research program helps us do that. So here in the United States, we have, as some of you know, and understand some of you have volunteered at or worked with, this is one of our healing sites in St. Paul and Dayton Avenue. The approach to our work is interdisciplinary, so it takes into account the individual needs of the clients that come to us. So it's psychosocial, psychotherapy, it's occupational therapy, there's physiotherapy, medical treatment, we have nurse on staff, social workers, and individual assessments are made about the needs of survivors who come to us, and then a treatment regimen is developed. This is the house, and the way this is structured is very deliberate. For most survivors who've been through a traumatic experience like torture, the first, and our staff and our program really works with the most traumatized, the most severely affected. And the first need is for those individuals to feel a sense of safety and to come into a stable environment. They've fled their countries because their lives were at risk. They had been tortured, and the after effects of that are very profound. So the first thing that we try to do is provide them with a sense of safety and stability. And the house, this treatment center, is designed that way. You can't see it, from the outside so much, but inside, the design of the treatment rooms are such that it lends itself to survivors feeling safe. So when there are sessions with individual torture survivors, the doors are never completely closed. They can always, if they feel they need to, run out. They don't want to, so they don't feel enclosed. There's not a bright, shining light. The lights are soft and subdued. Nothing that will remind them of an interrogation cell that they've been through, for example. The colors are soft. There's a lot of natural light that comes through. The rooms are not just square. There's always some rounded corners. The corridors are not straight. So these are the kinds of things that remind survivors of the traumatic events they've been through. And the first step in their recovery is to be able to, for them to gain a sense of safety and stability. The second phase then is that our clinicians use is to work through the traumatic experience that they've had. It's a stage called mourning and remembrance. And this is the time when, with the clinicians, they work through the traumatic experience that they've had. Often they might be telling it for the first time. Often it comes out in bits and pieces. It's not linear. People have a difficult time recalling some events. But that's an important part, the second stage in the process. And the third is, after that, is they've worked through that, is sessions that are designed then to help survivors reconnect in their new locations, in their communities. It's a sense a time when they have a sense they're able to reconnect with their families, with a new community. They go back to school, they get jobs, they start families and try to resume the rest of their life. So we have, this is for a long time was CBT's main healing site in the Twin Cities. We have a couple of other sites now in St. Paul, and also recently started in St. Cloud with the survivor community there, and have opened an office in Atlanta, Georgia as well in the last 3 years or so. So this is, I'll call her Mary. She's one of the former clients at our center in St. Paul. And I would say her, there's not a typical story. It's not an unusual story, but Mary is someone who had to flee her home country in Africa because she observed fraud during elections. And she reported that. She spoke out against it. She reported that. And as a result was targeted by the authorities. She was arrested, interrogated, tortured for over 4 weeks before she was released. But when she was released, the authorities told her, the Secret Service told her that they weren't finished with her, that they would come back and find her. So she knew that was a signal she had to leave. Mary is about 40 years old. She has 6 children, is married, and she left completely on her own. Was able to make her way here to the U.S. And was in CVT's care for many years. I've highlighted her case because she's typical of many in the sense that she's a political asylum applicant, and she applied for asylum shortly after arrival here. And she's been caught in that system now for over 5 years since she first arrived. She's had an initial hearing, but as you all are aware, the asylum process now is so overloaded and so broken. About a very high percentage of our clients are somewhere in the political asylum system, and many of them don't even have their initial interview until 3 years from now, or even longer. So that it's very overstretched. And I mention that because her shortly after she arrived, she was making great progress in terms of her recovery. Even though she was separated from her children, she doesn't know where her husband is. And over time now, over years after years, stuck in the system, not having a final answer about her case, she has begun to deteriorate because of this uncertainty as a result of her increasing loss of hope that she'll be reunited with her family again. So I mentioned that, and I used some language from her that she told our clinician because it's she feels that every day for her is a struggle. If she can make it through the day, then she's successful. So it's an example of how painstaking the process is. Progress isn't always linear. It doesn't always go forward. People have they fall backwards sometimes, and the systems and the policies that they're exposed to in a way very much contribute to that. Internationally, we work mostly in East Africa and in the Middle East, and in different kinds of settings. So we're in refugee camps, a couple in Kenya, in the north and the far east. Dadaab is a complex set of camps close to the Somali border. As some of you may know, Kakuma is in the northwest, mostly with South Sudanese refugees. In Ethiopia, we're also in the north of the country, working with Eritrean survivors who've come across. And in Uganda, we started recently a program in the Bidi camp. These are refugee camp settings, so the camps run by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So CBT is a part of the international humanitarian approach of delivery of services in the camps. We also work because many refugees don't settle or aren't in a refugee camp per se. They're drawn or they go to urban areas because some of them don't want to be in camps. Camps can be very confining even if there are services available. But there are very large numbers of refugees in Amman, Jordan, for example, or Zarqa, where we have clinics. Zarqa is a little bit closer to the Syrian border, and most of our clients in Jordan these days are Syrian. And then in Nairobi as well, where many refugees have sought shelter from different parts of Africa. So Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Ethiopia, the Sudan, South Sudan. And then finally, we work in northern Uganda in the areas that were formerly under the control of the militia group called the Lord's Resistance Army, which some of you may be familiar with, which had as part of its hallmark of operations abductions of children for use as porters, for use as sexual slaves, for use as child soldiers. So that war has wound down, although Joseph Kony, the leader, is still at large somewhere in Africa. But these what were then children, now adults, are coming back to their home communities in northern Uganda, highly traumatized, they're both perpetrators as well as victims, because they were forced to kill, and they were forced to even kill members of their own family or their neighbors. And you can imagine reintegrating into their home community where those events took place is very complex. So we also work in Gulu is the main area in northern Uganda, the larger city in the north, but we work in some of the surrounding villages. Another story from Jordan, like Mary, this is the Haddad family who escaped Syria, or who left Syria early on in the civil war. They lived in the north of the country and were caught between the government on the one hand and armed opposition forces and militias on the other. They were at a place where the government dropped barrel bombs, these indiscriminate weapons that are highly inaccurate. Their home was demolished, and they had no choice but to leave. There were snipers in the area, there was government artillery bombardment as well, and there was fighting on the other side from the militia. So there was no way they were going to be able to survive, and some of them were wounded. The Haddad family is a family of 7. 5 children, and they made their way to Amman and to our clinic there, also about 6 years ago. And we're making progress in their recovery. They were very fortunate in the sense that they had a relative in Arizona who petitioned to sponsor them here in the United States. And the application was accepted. So they went through the interviews with the International Office on Migration, with the Department of Homeland Security, with the Department of National Intelligence, with UNHCR, all these steps they go through to get clearance to come here. They took their vaccinations. They even were selling their furniture that they had in Jordan, taking English classes, getting ready to come. In fact, the only thing that was missing was the date of their flight to Phoenix. And then the first travel ban was handed down in that would have been January of 2017. And then the second travel ban was issued by the Trump administration in March. And then the third travel ban, the first 2 were overturned by courts, but the third was essentially upheld by the Supreme Court about a year ago now. I mention that because since those bans, the process for them to resettle has totally stopped. So since the travel ban, nothing further has happened in their case. And there too now, they were making good progress, but because of the uncertainty about what's going to happen, they are also increasingly suffering evidence of mental deterioration. So I mention that case to help try to convey how these policy decisions affect individual people, and in our case, clients that we're working with. And the hope of being reunited with their families, the hope of living in a safe and a stable place is what keeps people going. And then these decrees, these executive orders are issued, and it's much harder to maintain one's optimism and hope when these kinds of things happen. Very quickly, let me move through a few more things, and I want to leave time for discussion and questions. Our advocacy program, again, led out of our DC office, focuses in 3 areas. One of them has to do with confronting the legacy of U.S. torture. As we know, the U.S. engaged in torture at several points in its history, and perhaps most prominently, most recently, under the Bush administration post 9/11, as part of the counterterrorism campaign. So our involvement there at this stage is to work closely with the members of Congress and other human rights organizations to understand a little bit more what happened during that period. We still don't know the full extent of what transpired. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, for example, released an executive summary of an investigation they did about CIA involvement in torture. That summary alone was over 500 pages long. The full report is over 6,000 pages, and that still hasn't been made available. So we know a lot about what happened, and it's not pretty, as we all know, but there's also still a lot we don't know. So transparency is an objective. Then tightening the loopholes in the law, which was exploited, which allowed some of these things to happen, or was interpreted by lawyers to be legal, to tighten those loopholes. And then finally, in that area, at some point, to work towards accountability for those who ordered, those who carried out, those who perpetrated these acts, that they will be in some form held accountable. We also work closely with especially the Congress on during the appropriations process to try to have allocated federal support for torture survivor rehabilitation. You know, the United States funds survivor of torture programs through the Department of Health and Human Services. They also, through USAID, provide torture center support for similar programs around the world. And CVT is under contract with both HHS and the Department of State to provide the support to those centers so that they can extend treatment. It's not a large amount. I mean, it's not a small amount. It's at the moment, it's a total of about $30 million through the various sources. Health and Human Services is about $11 million. And even during the Trump administration, this last Congress, the last budget, we've seen an increase to 14 million. So it, you know, despite the administration's objectives, Congress has still been both Democrats and Republicans supportive of this program. So you know, for us, it's an indication that, you know, we have to be careful and want to work to ensure bipartisan support in Congress, and we can, and on an issue like torture, have been, you know, somewhat successful. Again, it's not, you know, a huge amount, but the $14 million for the domestic treatment centers, including ours, is a very important source of support. The U.S. also supports the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture, so we lobby, advocate to keep the U.S. funding to increase that, and at a minimum keep it at its current level. And then the third sort of broad area, and this is assuming a larger and larger focus of our time, is working on asylum and refugee-related matters. Because as you know, the numbers of refugee admissions under the Trump administration has dropped dramatically. The last year Obama was in office, the number of admissions was around 85,000. The administration had set a ceiling for the following year of 115,000. When Trump came in, that was dropped to 45,000, and for this year, it's down to 30,000, the lowest since the refugee resettlement program began. But they're not even going to reach the 30,000. You know, it'll be, if we get to 20,000, that's I think the most that people are expecting. And of those, almost none from the countries that are most severely affected by the crises we see. Almost no Syrians, almost no Afghans, people from Afghanistan. There are others who are also in need of support, but because of the Muslim ban, the protections are not available to people from, essentially not available to people from those countries. So I've mentioned the impact of the Trump administration, the impact on refugee policy, on torture policy. I think, as you all know, Trump himself is a proponent of torture, and during the campaign was quite vocal about that. And many feel that it's only his defense minister, who was there, James Mattis, the reason why torture policy was not implemented again. There's a worry now that Mattis has resigned, and there's an acting secretary, that there's an opportunity for example, there be another attack in the United States, that the president could quickly try to push a policy of torture. We were very active in, Gina Haspel is the new, well, no longer new, but the CIA director now. And during her, as I'm sure you are aware and read during her confirmation process, she has had direct involvement herself in torture. She ran the secret site, the black site in Thailand, where some of the most severe torture took place. We normally don't take positions as a matter of policy on individuals in positions, but on this case, because her direct involvement was so well documented, we felt that we had to oppose her confirmation. She was confirmed anyway, and is in that role now. And then finally, with respect to human rights policy under the Trump administration, as we've all seen, it's human rights is almost never a part of conversations, foreign policy conversations with heads of state, and so it has because of the role the U.S. is playing, it has very little moral authority to speak out on these issues. Obviously, examples, of course, are the killing of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis and the U.S. response to that. This is the Washington Post journalist who was dismembered in the Turkish in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. Saudi consulate. Thank you. As just one example, the leader of Egypt was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, who has imprisoned tens of thousands of people there who are perceived to oppose his rule. Not a word from the U.S. Government about that. And there are so many other examples these days. Just a little bit on asylum and refugee protection. So, refugee and asylum seeker. There's, we hear a lot about this in the news, and it can be confusing. Who's a refugee and who's an asylum seeker? And basically, all it means is that they're fleeing the same situation. They're fleeing persecution because of their race or because of their religion, their race, their political opinion, their membership in a particular social group. And if they arrive at our border and ask for asylum, there are asylum seekers. Refugees they apply for refugee status abroad, and if are given that status, then are able to come to be resettled here. And the Trump administration, of course, has been trying, especially over the course, since the advent of the administration, to try to squeeze the space that's available for asylum seekers and refugees, not only in terms of numbers, but making it far more difficult for people who are fleeing persecution to be able to seek protection. They're pitting asylum seekers against refugees. You've all read about how at the southern border, how the ports of entry are the only places now where survivors can apply for asylum, and even then, only a certain number per day, what they're calling metering. Having asylum seekers wait in line in Mexico rather than in the U.S., or if they're in the U.S., increasingly detaining individuals, family separation, all as part of a deterrent to restrict the flow. I won't go into this in any detail, but this is a graph that describes the various ways the process works. Human Rights First, a colleague organization of ours that we work closely with on these matters, produced this. One important fact to understand is that a very high percentage of refugees are survivors of torture. Not all of them are, but studies that we have done indicate that 44% of all refugees arriving in the U.S. are survivors of torture since 1975. So about 3 million refugees have arrived since 75, and that means an estimated up to 1.3 million survivors of torture in the U.S. Now, not all of those are in need of specialized care of the kind that CBT provides, but a large number are. So, we reach about 25,000 per year at our combined locations, primary or secondary survivors. And even with a decreased refugee flow into the U.S., the need continues to grow because the rate of survivors among refugees is so high. Family separation has a profound effect on children, as we know. This is a quote from one of our clinicians. Immigration detention, as we spoke about earlier, the facilities in which asylum seekers are being detained are constant reminders of situations the refugees have fled from. So, uniforms, guns, these facilities where there are, bars on the doors. These all bring back, flashbacks from what they've been through, and so it's just profoundly disturbing that people fleeing their lives and in search of protection, instead of being provided care, or their trauma is likely to continue. And now, last week or earlier this week, you probably read that the Trump administration is planning to charge to make asylum seekers pay a fee to apply for asylum, and not to allow them to work. Asylum seekers are able to work after a 6-month period after they've applied for asylum. But now they want to take that away as well. So I'm
wondering if we can go to question time, because we've got to quit right at 10:20.
Okay, let's do that. So some of the things we're doing, and there are things that we could do, and we could talk about that during the question and answer period. So thank you for your attention, and thank you. And I look forward to questions that you might have. Yes, and then, yeah.
What I'd like to say is that I think the United States government is one of the greatest violators of human rights on this planet for all our interventions and what we do in the countries we go to. And one thing that I'm wondering, do you ever work on Palestinian, the abuse that Israel is inflicting on Palestinians? Do you ever talk about that?
Yes, one of I mentioned the USAID contract that we have, which is to support torture survivor centers in other parts of the world. There is a group in Ramallah in the West Bank that has been a long-time partner of ours. So we work with, at the moment, about 10 groups in other parts of the world, on 4 continents. And at the moment, we don't have the group in Ramallah as a partner, but we are working to train and build the capacity as an unofficial partner with the staff of that organization. I prior to coming to CVT, I spent a lot of time in the West Bank and did some of my undergraduate studies there, and then worked with the United Nations with the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I ran their office in the Gaza Strip. So this was a time when, as still is the case, the Gaza is under under blockade, and the resultant violations of human rights are widespread and systematic, and happening frequently, and especially in Gaza, the children, the traumatized population of children, almost all of them are exhibiting the after effects of the traumatic events they've been through. It's in Gaza, for example, there are no bomb shelters. There's none of that.
A meeting I went to Global Solutions.
Yeah.
She was in a bomb shelter with some Israelis.
Yeah.
When the rockets and Hamas fires it, when the rockets that Israelis fire into Israel are so ineffective, but Israeli rockets and bombs are not. And yet the world almost seems to just gives Israel a blank check.
Yeah.
And it just enrages it.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
I'd like to know how you maintain your equanimity in the face of this overwhelming evil. And I'm sure that you must be focusing on those positive things that you're able to do. But that seems like pretty slim nourishment in the face of what goes on everywhere. Can you tell us how you manage this?
Yeah, you know, it's for the staff at the center. You know, it's a very mission-driven place. People are very committed to human rights, to do what they can do to alleviate suffering and this kind of suffering in the world. So we, you know, we have staff who have been clinicians for one of them over 30 years. This year is her 30th year. Of the 34 years CVT has been in existence, she's been a clinician seeing survivors for 30 of those years. The director of our clinical services program has been with CVT 24 years, and we have a series of 20, 15. So we have incredible long-term experience. And, you know, I think despite what they hear day in, all day in and day out, the horror stories that come from clients, they also are able to see, and we see, you know, people recover from the most horrible things they've been through. And are a part of that recovery process. And it's incredibly inspiring to see the resilience and the courage and the strength that survivors have, and how they are able to, you know, draw on their resources with a little bit of support, and are able to rebuild their lives and go on and be, you know, incredibly productive. You know, not everyone who goes through a program is a success story, but a very high, the rates of improvement, increase in functionality, decrease in pain, people are able to engage with society. They go back to, as I mentioned, to get degrees, they get jobs, they become taxpayers. And we see that, and our staff see that. And so on the one hand, you see, you know, the most horrible things and hear about the most horrible things. And on the other hand, you see these miracles, really, that happen on an almost daily basis. And I think that's what gives our staff, what gives me the strength to, you know, to continue the work. When you see what individuals who have been through these kinds of events are, despite all that, they're able to rebuild their lives and become, you know, amazing individuals, do incredible things. And I think that's what contributes. We try to pay attention to self-care so that we don't burn out staff. We, you know, encourage them to take the leaves that they're entitled to, various kinds of support programs. And you know, still staff deal with it in different ways, and you know, and some of them are not able to do the work for very long. But I, as you know, as director of the organization, I feel very fortunate to have an incredible collection of probably cumulatively the most experience in anywheres in the world assembled in one place, working on torture survivor rehabilitation. It's a huge asset for the organization. Thank you.
Yes, I was late coming in. You may have touched on this or talked about it, but I'm wondering about Guantanamo Bay and your thinking. Are you involved? Have you been? Will you be in? Or do you have a policy? So forth. What is your involvement? I'd really be interested in knowing.
Yeah, the question was about CVT's role with respect to Guantanamo Bay. And from the inception, CVT has been calling for the closure of the camp, and we're continuing to do that. But beyond that, and right now, the possibilities of you know, for closure under this administration are nil. But what we are doing is working quite closely with certain of the Defense Counsel for detainees, who are providing information to us about their medical situation and their needs. Many of them have been severely tortured, and many of them don't have access to rehabilitative services in the camp. And we have been asked, whether we would be open to providing those services in the camp. And we've discussed this, and our clinicians say, we can't be put in that kind of dilemma, because the prospect of providing care when survivors, torture victims, are still in a hostile environment it's not helpful. So what we are doing, and we are about to release a detailed report with our colleagues at Physicians for Human Rights about specific individual prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and a description of their medical situation and their medical needs. And we'll be making recommendations to Congress, and there are some in Congress who are interested in providing some kind of redress for them. And we'll be making recommendations to the administration as well, although the hope that there will be much done about them is not high. And we continue to call on public to pressure their elected representatives to raise concerns about this matter. So yes, Guantanamo Bay remains an important issue for us, and the role that we feel we can play is help educate the public and our own government about now the responsibilities our own government has, and we as a people have, for their torture, which was at the end of the day carried out in the names of all of us. It's the conditions, as I'm sure you're aware of some of the individuals who have been badly tortured there, is extremely severe. So we're providing things like affidavits in the court proceedings before the military commissions. So we're trying to do what we can from the angle we feel we're placed to do something.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is, how could President Trump have gotten by with the separation of children from their parents at points of entry? And number two, what has happened, and what are the statistics on the numbers of children who yet are separated from their parents?
The first question about how the administration, how Trump could have gotten away with this is, I think at the end of the day, he didn't get away with parts of it, at least. I mean, it was a program that was begun in 2017 before any of us knew about it. But as soon as evidence became available, and was brought to the attention of the public, there was an outcry, and it caused Trump and his administration to largely reverse the policy. There still has been, and the testimony of the head of DHS before the Senate last week, he was asked about child separation, and it's still separation of families, and it's still happening. Every day, a small number. I mean, he said only about 2 cases per day, but that has added up since the policy was reversed from last June. There still are close to 400 separated children that are known about, and of course there are many more in all likelihood that we don't know about. The court has ordered the government to reunite the children with their families, and is making efforts to do that, and has done that in many cases, but not all of them. And there are still several dozen where they just don't know how to proceed. And the second part of your question was, okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think you have some literature there on the table
Yep.
that people can grab. And thank you for a very informative presentation. And, you know, we really thank you for coming out this Sunday morning and speaking to us.
Thank you.